This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
A couple things. This is wrapping up. We're wrapping up the case of Ellen Greenberg. That's like what we're looking at doing. A number of things are going on here. What you were talking about, death by 1,000 cuts, in the last episode, I had to go look that up. It's actually Ling Chi. Are you familiar with this?
No.
It's called the slow process. It translates as the lingering death or the slow slice. It was actually a punishment. It was not something someone did to themselves. It was a form of torture and execution. It was used in China. The practice ended in the early 1900s. Go ahead.
I wasn't implying earlier that.
No. Okay. I just thought it was an interesting thing that it was a punishment.
Well, that's exactly what I was saying when I was like, have you ever heard the term death by 1,000 cuts? And it would be like somebody killing themselves in a punishing way.
I just thought it was interesting that was actually very accurate for the suicide in a punishing way, for it to be reminiscent of Ling Chi for me. That's all. So this is a process that involved tying the condemned prisoner to a wooden frame, and then they would cut parts of their body out as they went. It's crazy, but the parts are specified under different laws. I looked it up a little bit, and I thought about covering it more, but the more I tried to look at it, the weirder it got. It was just something you had brought up in the last episode.
So it actually said, like, if you break this law, this part's got to go?
The flesh would be cut from the body in multiple slices in a process that, so they don't detail all of that. But think of it like if you steal something, you lose a hand. It's variations of that.
Yeah, I gotcha.
But it was not a good death, is my point. And I may be understanding some of it, because as I started to read it, it's like the first thing that popped out at me was like, the Western perception of this is all wrong. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that explains. I'm going to have some misconceptions here. They told me up front that I am not going to understand the Qing dynasty, which is when they actually ended this in the early 1900s. So there's that, although it did go on for several thousand years. Another thing you said led me to thinking about Ling Chi was interesting, but you said something that I wanted to look up, and I didn't find a definitive answer on this, and I don't know how much it made its way into the episode as we're recording. But the idea was like whether or not people who have a mental health practitioner they go and see kill themselves more often than people who don't. There's not a clear answer on this, but I did find a really interesting article from The Atlantic that I wanted to share with you. It's from 2015. It's how patient suicide affects psychiatrists. And it's relevant to this case. So, mental health practitioners whose clients kill themselves can face stigma from their colleagues, lawsuits, and a toll on their own psyches, making them less likely to take on suicidal patients who need their help. This is from January 20th of 2015 in The Atlantic. And here's how the article reads. It's hard to listen to a psychiatrist who sounds so broken. I expect a mental health provider to seem healthy and detached, but even over the phone, the weariness in Dr. Brown's voice is palpable. This is what we do when people die, he says. Even if they die an expected death, it seems to be human nature to go back over it. What should I have said that I didn't, or shouldn't have said that I did? Could I have done more, or did I do too much? This seems to be part of the grieving process. I think it's especially intense in a situation where you have a direct responsibility for helping the person to get better. Brown lost a patient to suicide last year, a long-term client of his. She was the mother of a large, loving family. Right after a session with him, she went home and she killed herself. 2 months later, Brown's son did the same thing. He doesn't want to talk about his son. It's still too immediate and painful, but he does tell me how he felt after his patient died. I went to the funeral, he says quietly. I stood for the entire service, and it was completely packed with people just standing. And so I was thinking as I was listening to the service, that I was the only person in that room who had that particular relationship with that woman. Everybody else knew her in some different way. They were friends, they were family, they were relatives. Maybe they knew her in the congregation, and I was the only one who had been working with her, seeing her the day before, trying to prevent this. I felt unique and not in a very flattering way. Suicide at the time is the third leading cause of death for young adults and the 10th leading cause of death for the general population. The doctors I spoke with about this gave me different statistics on the number of mental health professionals whose patients commit suicide. One says 51% of psychiatrists. Another tells me it's as high as 80% of all people who work in the mental health field, including psychologists, social workers, etc. The stigma of suicide is so strong that it's often an issue that's left unspoken, even by doctors. Many psychiatrists refuse to treat chronically suicidal patients, not only because of the stigma that surrounds it and even their profession, but because suicide is a number one cause of lawsuits brought against mental health treatment providers. Until a few years ago, I would often comfort myself with the fact that if the pain got bad enough, I'd be able to end it. When I was 21, I was diagnosed with a severe mental illness, but I didn't really start to understand what it was until a couple of years later. All I knew was that when I was sober, the only thing I felt was a deep, boundless shame at my very existence, the conviction that I was irreparably flawed, rotten from the inside out. So for almost 10 years, I was rarely sober. I had borderline personality disorder. As far as borderline patients go, I was never particularly suicidal. I made a couple of half-hearted attempts when things were really bad, and during my fits of hysterical depression, I would almost never take that agony out on my own body. Almost. But that's not the norm for people with my diagnosis. An estimated 80% of borderline patients attempt suicide, with an average of 3 attempts per person. According to most statistics, about 10% succeed, making BPD one of the most lethal existing psychiatric illnesses. Thanks to much hard work, medication, and therapeutic treatment, as well as a financial investment so large I don't even like to think about it, I no longer fit the diagnostic criteria for the disorder, but many of the friends I made along the way still do. Margaret is one of them. I recently drove to Boston to visit her in the mental hospital. It's been her home for 4 months. Every time she's discharged, she tried to kill herself again. This time, she tried to hang herself. The time before, she almost stepped in front of a train. After the hanging incident, her doctor decided to stop working with her, and now she can't find a new one. So this article goes on to discuss this particular type of relationship and how borderline personality disorder sufferers frequently find themselves at a higher risk for suicide, according to the author and the statistics they've gathered. I thought that was an interesting perspective to hear a patient talking about doctors who have lost their patients. Other than this group, there are some instances where doctors lose their patients to suicide, but you are correct. The act of having a psychiatric practitioner, so to speak, does assist even this group to some degree with having a lower propensity to attempt suicide or to have suicidal ideations. So it's not a complete answer to your question, but I did think that it was, it's a complicated question. I thought this was an interesting factor in it.
Well, and, I don't really, I want to tread lightly here because I have opinions based on my experiences that may not necessarily apply to everyone else. I want to just sort of point out that it's my opinion that I'm not entirely sure people who attempt suicide are always suicidal.
There is an element of attention seeking. Is that what you're thinking?
I'm thinking if I'm going to be completely honest here, people who commit suicide, not attempt to commit suicide, they commit suicide. They probably never said a word about it to anybody.
I think that's largely true, actually.
It's a couple of different things, and depending on your experience in life, you could see it a different way. But in my experience in life, there's people who attempt suicide, and then there's people who commit suicide. And, Everybody has like, I don't want to be alive anymore thoughts occasionally, right? It'd be weird if you've never thought that. I'd say that you, like, might need to partake in some more activities to be overwhelmed enough to feel that way. But they're two different things in my opinion. And I hear what is being said in that article and I appreciate that. But my question immediately was, well, was the therapist's son seeing a therapist?
They don't go very deep into
I know
the detail
that,
about
and it's
him.
none of my business, but I'm just saying, like, when you've got now, and obviously the main subject of that story completely contradicts what I'm saying because she was, she had an appointment with him. She was suicidal, and then she went home and committed suicide, right? But I'm not saying that never happens. I'm just saying, in large part, there are people that thrive off the attention. And I honestly, I think that that's why psychiatrists refuse to treat them. Because if you're like, 3 suicide attempts in, I mean, but
Okay.
you see what I'm saying, though.
Yeah, no, you raised a number of issues, and I have trouble talking about suicide because of the exact stigmas that are being talked about here. It's a very confusing thing for me when I see that someone has been declared a suicide or is a suicide. I have all these thoughts of like, what happened to that person, even when I don't have a personal connection. My curiosity is just like, where were things going that's where it got to. More often than not, I find that the adage we had spoken about, it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem, is true. There are instances where I look at something where there's some family annihilation cases I've looked at over the years. There have been cases where people have taken other criminal measures, like huge things have happened in their life that probably, like, their choice was, do I want to spend the rest of my life in prison after I'm caught, or do I want to kill myself? And they go that direction of killing themselves. It's complicated to look at cases where the authorities say this is a suicide, but the truth is the people who deal with suicides the most might not even be the practitioners of psychiatric medicine. It might actually be more apt to say that it is the first responders of the world, because they're the ones who end up on a scene looking at the results of a suicide and basically, in a lot of instances, having to declare death. I found there was something else you said that, like, I am still down a path, but I pulled up an article that I translated quickly. It was actually at Cairn, like CAIRN.info, but this was a fascinating little read to me, and I thought you would appreciate some of it. You said, what if someone killed themselves to punish someone else? And how you phrased it a particular way.
I said that it's like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting observation, and I wanted to sort of explore that a little bit. So, I find myself reading the craziest amount of stuff in my research here. Some of it there doesn't really go anywhere, and some of it I'm able to share because it like relates to something we've been doing or asking. This is an article that is it's kind of a strange piece, but it's called "On Killing by Self-Killing," and it's subtitled "Suicide with a Hostile Intent." It was written in February of 2006 by a guy named Antonio Preti, and it's under the Studies of Death is the collection for this journal. The introduction is very interesting. So some months ago, a woman in Macau wore a red suit and threw herself out of the window. As she had explained in a farewell note, the red suit was to help her turn into a terrifying ghost that would haunt her husband, who had caused her too much suffering. This piece of news was confined to the records of macabre curiosities, and I was unable to retrieve the original newspaper headline. Anyways, this episode occurred in one of the paradises of modern globalization in Macau, highlights how alive ancient beliefs still are, despite the innovations of the most advanced frontiers of economy. The dramatic gesture of the Macau woman falls into a long chain of behaviors where the intent to inflict some harm to the one seen as the cause of one's own misfortunes mingles with a wish to bring their pain to a sure, though fatal, end. According to Freud, all suicides contemplate both a wish to die, to express a pressure to self-destruction that cannot be worked through, and the intent to harm anyone the suicidal person thinks has caused the unbearable pain leading them to the self-imposed death. In some categories of suicides, however, the hostile intent and the aim to harm and burden the others seem the primary reason for the act. I'd never thought of suicide this way, and I'm going to read a little bit more, but have you ever thought of suicide as a hostile thing?
I would say a lot of times it's a hostile thing. I think that sometimes it takes the hostility felt towards somebody, especially somebody that's like scorned you, to kill yourself. But the problem is it's the thought process behind that is in your head. It's like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
Yeah. Well, this goes on to say, and I had not thought of it this way really, as a vengeful act or a hostile act, but the way they wrap up this first section is the category of suicide with hostile intent encompasses a disparate class of behaviors that ranges from acts of revenge, such as the one of the anonymous woman of Macau, to desperate attempts to inflict damage to one's own persecutors, as in the biblical legend of Samson. Not to forget the advanced military procedures applied by the Roman army and perhaps by other Indo-European peoples. This class could also include the modern assault technique of suicide bombing attacks, or the pathological self-destructive behavior of spree killers attempting to avenge themselves by self-immolation together with the largest number of victims as possible. And they reference the Columbine incident. It cannot be excluded, therefore, that a more thorough investigation of the dynamics operating in the proposed class of suicide with hostile intent could contribute to designing preventative strategies against violence at large. I thought that was interesting because the idea is if you make people happy and deal with people's depression, that you could squash violence. And this goes on a really long historical look at everything that you could think of, including like World War II and the Holocaust and a lot of different suicides over the ages of modern history. I thought that was pretty interesting to take that approach. And we briefly considered, like, would someone in the position of being a fiance and going through the stress of getting married and having changes at work and everything, would they potentially frame a loved one for their murder?
And it comes up in this case because it seems so unlikely that Ellen's injuries were self-inflicted, right? That's why there's this controversy even 11 years later. And it seems like the other side of that would be that her fiance was responsible for killing her, because it seems like an outlier. For example, the weirdo in the hoodie roaming the building seems like that would have come up already, right?
And we made this guy up. He's not real.
Right. He doesn't exist, but it's basically the thought that, a third party did this. So it wasn't Ellen, it wasn't Sam, it's somebody else, right? And it just seems unlikely that, without any information. We see the first responders coming into the building. It seems like anybody else that was relevant would have been, mentioned as well. And there's just not anybody. And so my thought was, did they have a fight? And did she get so aggravated that, she was like, well, I'm going to show him, right? And she killed herself to framed him for it. Now, he wasn't charged with it. So I would say she was unsuccessful if that's what happened. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying it was a perspective to be considered, because to me, it seems like they were at a very, I'm not saying that their lives were volatile, but it's a time in life where things can be volatile. And that would be like when you're, starting your career, you're planning a wedding, you're making like these big life decisions, or at least you think they're big. They are big life decisions, but it can be really overwhelming.
Yeah, it can be. And it's interesting, the cases that we've talked about in the course of talking about her, like some of the stuff that's gone on with these people, they all have what could be considered relative triggers. Um, because like with the army captain, like some of that affects his career and affects his placement going forward. When you sign up, even though National Guard may be part time, that's a very serious life circumstance that you consider to be like a career, even if it's part time. You consider it to be a career, and he's an officer, so that's a serious thing to be in charge of other people. With this particular case, you know, I I I find myself like in sort of a weird position here because I see the push that the family has made. I did entertain the guy with a hoodie, or a random intruder of some kind. I entertained Sam versus Ellen, having done it in large part because I could not get over the marks on her, like the bruising. You pointed out to me previously that like she's around kids, and you make a great point because I have dogs and I have had kids that were around the age of the people she's shaping into future leaders. And you can end up with a lot of strange marks on your body that you don't really realize why they got there.
Right. And because, like, in theory, some of the comments made on her autopsy examination and the summary report of it was she had like lots of bruises in various stages, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I hate to, like, I'm older than she was, but like I constantly have bruises that are in various stages, and I would look like I was like an abuse victim if I died right now and somebody was examining my body, because I just have scratches and bruises. I mean, it happens from kids, dogs, chickens, home improvement projects gone awry, and it's just stuff that happens.
This is one of those cases that ultimately I thought this would just remain a mystery. And I actually feel bad, like looking through it all, and like, when I see a family that's pushing for what they're pushing for, I question some of the motives involved. I know they want justice for their kid, and I know they want a real answer to what happened to their kid. And so I guess that it becomes a question of like, what is their intention? What is their motive for continuing forward? And there's a lot of money that's gone into this. I don't know what you think of that, but there's a lot of experts. There's a lot of investigations that have gone on independently. There's a lot of legal haranguing that's gone on. And so originally when this was mentioned to me, the question was posed, did I think it was a homicide or a suicide? And I have arrived at a conclusion. Have you?
I have. Well, I've arrived at several along the way, actually. But yes, I think so.
Yeah. So this one, so my answer to that is neither, and then it's going to take me about 20 minutes to explain what I mean. I don't think it's a homicide, and I also don't think it's a suicide. And
I don't either.
This is really, it's complex to explain, but we agree, right? Mostly.
I think so. Yeah, I believe so. It sort of started when I was reviewing the paperwork. So what kind of got us on a track about talking about suicide and everything was she was seeing a psychiatrist, and she was taking medicine for her mental health. And there was a series of appointments that occurred, and it looked like she was going about once a week starting at the beginning of the year. And so she died on January 26th, and her next appointment was the following day. And the narrative that went along with that information was that, they spoke with the psychiatrist concerning her, unexpected demise. And it was mentioned that she had been prescribed Zoloft. And then when Zoloft wasn't working as she thought it should be, she was prescribed Xanax instead. And then she was prescribed Klonopin and Ambien to help her get some sleep.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, like when you're looking at it, it's in the narrative of almost every report that I've found related to this, but you can skip over some of the things that are going on there. And if you've, I come from a position where I've known a lot of people that have gone to see psychiatrists, and I personally have seen psychiatrists and psychologists to deal with different things in my life at different times of my life. This is so strange to say this, but when you're dealing with psychiatrists and psychologists, they really only get as much out of you as you give.
That's correct.
And one of the things we noticed, skimming through these files, there are more interesting things to look at than just Ellen's relationship with Ellen, who was her psychiatrist, which I thought was sort of interesting that they're both named Ellen. One of the things that I thought was pretty, it was my rabbit hole that I went down. I think you saw this too. You were looking at some of the Gavin Fish stuff that he had done, right?
After the 911 call, yeah, because it kind of directed me there somehow. And I was looking, he basically had a good place with all the information that he had taken the time to get and sort of corral in an easy to go through format.
Yeah, and if there's some kind of controversy surrounding him or anything, I don't know much about him. The only thing I know is my kid is subscribed to something there, and so it was found for me when I was like, oh, I wonder what could I do to get some more of this information. One of the things that he did, which I love, it's like one of my favorite things, is he backs up everything with the PDFs. It's right there on his webpage.
I was going to say, I don't know anything about his reputation, but I do know that every single thing I looked at, it had nothing to do with him, really.
Yeah,
it was all official documents.
Yeah, it's super well sourced, which is why I keep mentioning it. And I did not need a lot of what he put up there. I did go through quite a bit of it, but it is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. One of the most interesting things that stood out to me in all of that was they sort of jump on this medical examiner, which is, that's an important part of the timeline, which is also on that page. And you pointed it out to me at first that there's a draft autopsy created where Marlon Osborne finds that this is a homicide. And so what happens after that is the police department spokesperson treats that as misinformation. And they they have an official death certificate that says homicide. And then they have a amended death certificate reflecting that it's a suicide.
Right. And it seemed almost the way it played out was and so in the media accounts of, this being a homicide, they actually said, no, that's wrong. This was a suicide. Right. And so that's what's kind of being funneled out in the public's perspective. And the thought is that the police department was putting pressure on the medical examiner to change this from homicide to suicide.
Yeah. And this guy, this is Philadelphia. This is Philadelphia, for people who don't know, it is a large city, and it is a busy medical examiner's office. And one of the things that even 10 years ago, I think the population of Philadelphia probably would have been something like 2 million people, maybe a little less than that, at least 1.5 million people here. So this is going to be a really full office. And one of the things that Gavin Fish did that I always appreciate, sometimes don't know what to do with it, is he included written reprimands from the city of Philadelphia's supervising doctor that were related to Marlon Osborne's finding in other cases.
Right.
Which one of the things that we ran into here is there was this issue about Dr. Lucy being a neuropathologist who supposedly had looked at the spinal cord here, either in X-ray or photo, or maybe in person, and made a finding that there was no defect. And after reading some of this, I kind of got the impression that this guy's like running around with giant X-rays, going, "Hey, can you?" I mean, I don't mean to laugh about this because I'm not laughing about the victim. I'm just laughing about the circumstances because later they say, "Oh, we couldn't find any record of that," but he really means he like held it up in front of the light box and was like, "Do you see a defect?" She was like, "Nope," and she was doing something completely different. Doesn't even remember it happened. He's trying to get a free consult on this case because he doesn't want to go through a lot of extra trouble because he's got 15 more autopsies to do that day.
Right. And he's got to redo like 15 other ones that he didn't do correctly.
And so, yeah, that's one of the things that comes up in here is like they start listing out his cases and it's by number. They tell him, they're like, look, we went through 2009 to 2010. There were some significant deficiencies in your work. And like, you're really going to have to like go through here and you're going to have to fix this. This guy is so overwhelmed that he is going through and he's making mistakes that in some instances are like template based. Do you use templates in your life? Do you know what I mean?
No,
like
I have
forms?
Previously, but no, not currently. But I think the thought was that like sometimes, and that's where N/A comes from, to make sure you tab through all the different spaces, because if one blank space is applicable to a case and you put something in there, but it's not applicable to another case and you don't get to that box, and you leave whatever you put on the previous case there, it ends up not making sense, right? And all of these things are included in this particular set of documents to attack this guy's credibility.
Yeah, they're attacking his credibility, but realistically what's happening here is he is doing so many cases at a time that mistakes are being made because he's using a templated format to try and keep everything as organized as possible. And for instance, I'm going to get through this without laughing, but it's very difficult for me to do because it's not related to the victims or anything. It's just related to sort of the absurdity in the semantics of it all, which is something that I drilled out on quite a bit. But for instance, it's got a case number and it says cause of death, stab wound to the chest. And this is his boss making this observation. He says the end of the external examination contains the sentence, the body has no external evidence of recent significant trauma. And he says, considering the decedent died of a stab wound to the chest, this sentence is inaccurate. I recommend that if a template is used, care must be taken to remove sentences or statements from the template that contradict the findings of the autopsy.
I think that the absurdity in the statements themselves, they plainly show it's just mistakes being made. It's like, I mean, it's more than typos. But my point is, it's not malfeasance. I don't even think it's incompetence, really. It's just...
It's a rush and a lack of detail orientation.
Right. And, I can't believe for a second, I just feel like perhaps, I don't know about you, I have no idea if this is like something that commonly occurs or not, if they had super high expectations, if like he should have an assistant that like reads over this stuff before it becomes an official document, right?
Right.
Like, I don't know what the solution there is, but I feel like it's somewhere between like him just being really overwhelmed and then like something not quite meeting what needs to happen. Because I don't think this guy's like, I'm going to be the worst medical examiner ever and all of my reprimands are going to be included, for the public to see, because it's embarrassing, right? I mean, I'm embarrassed for him.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that he's a human, first of all.
It proves the errors, how absurd they are. It just proves the point that it is just a mistake.
Yeah, so going through all of this, I can't find exactly where I'm headed with this. Being mentioned in here is a possibility. And that's sort of, we've got this other case that we've been working on that we're looking at a medical examiner either having made a mistake or maybe having some sort of a confirmation bias going on in how they look at certain cases. This one, there are so many pieces of paper here, and that's why Gavin Fish comes up, and that's why I mention it. Not because he did a good job, he did a bad job, whatever, because everybody seems to have missed this. And I don't know that the police department did. The attorney general comes out and basically agrees with the police department. Marlon Osborne sort of acts like the police department basically led him to changing things to be a suicide. And everybody wants this to be this huge mystery. We can't figure out why they're asking for homicide or undetermined, which is what the family is essentially asking for. They want the case reopened. They want it to be to either be.
No, they've asked for it to be ruled to be at least undetermined.
Right. So the idea is that resources could potentially be applied to determine what potentially happened here. But it seems like everybody has missed one really important thing. And we almost missed it. We mentioned it earlier. I don't know if you picked up on us.
I mean, I because of my experience, I immediately thought, well, that doesn't seem right.
Well, no, I'm saying, like, I said we almost missed it. I didn't say we missed it. I said we almost missed it, but everybody else did miss it.
Well, and so have you seen any sort of context anywhere that would suggest that
I don't
maybe
think anybody has picked up on this. And that's that's the reason I'm bringing it up here, the way I'm bringing it up. Because, look, when we get into like these cases, I don't like to make a huge assumption. I made Meg come back to look at the toxicology report with me. And so I don't have a lot of experience with Zoloft. You had an understanding of Zoloft, and we were looking at the toxicology report, and we realized there's no Zoloft. So
there is not any, and there is a. Can you say it for me? Zolpidem.
Okay, so there is Ambien, the generic form being Zolpidem. And then there's clonazepam, which is the Klonopin she's been prescribed. It's in the heaviest dose that's in here. Here's what we realized. If you take the findings from the documents that all these people put together in the investigation, and look, if somebody else has made this conclusion and we're not the first ones, I'm not trying to take credit away from those people. Give it to them. I just want to point it out because I don't see it mentioned. Your timeline is too short on all of this. It's terrible how it looks. So when you go to a doctor and they prescribe you a SSRI like Zoloft, you're going on to it. It's not going to look like it does here. So here's how it looks in the witness reports here, or the witness notes. It says that Ellen Berman was interviewed and stated, like I started with at the beginning of this, that she had seen her 3 times and was planning for a 4th time the day after this. However, somehow in between the 12th, the 17th, the 19th, and then the 26th is when she dies, with the next appointment being on the 27th, she has taken her on and off multiple medications. And in the internet searches prior to her coming in, she was looking for citrulline. Did you see that?
Yeah, I saw it.
So the internet searches indicate that sometime on the 6th and then again on the 9th of January that year, she has basically gone on, or someone has gone on and looked up the benefits of Zoloft versus Prozac, and then like what citrulline does to the body. And it appears that they decided that like they needed to look up like did citrulline cause weight gain. My guess is that's related to the wedding. It's like they're thinking of like, I'm going to be in this dress, and like she doesn't want to like look weird being on the citrulline, so she wanted something different, or she had an adverse effect. It doesn't matter which.
Well, was she on it yet?
She would not have been on it yet. It would have been 3 days before she would go on it. She comes in on the 12th, according to what they have here. Now that could be slightly different. There could be like she called in a script for something like that. I don't know.
She would have had to have seen her, I think, in person at least the first time.
I think she would have seen her, yeah. So the gist of that is she goes on and she looks at Zoloft versus Prozac side effects. She looks at citrulline, which is the generic for Zoloft, making you gain weight, and all the things that are related to her internet searches. I think what happened was she panicked when she started to take it and probably went off it between. So she sees her on the 12th and she gets the script. I think she probably took it through the next visit. So the next visit on here is, okay, so Ellen Berman's interview on the 27th, she says she saw her on the 12th and she saw her on the 17th. So in order for this sentence to be true, which is the decedent was initially prescribed medication expressing uneasiness of taking medication. She tried Zoloft first, then switched to a low dose of Xanax. After no success, she was prescribed Ambien and Klonopin. That means each time she goes in to see this doctor in January, she got a new script. That's 3 different scripts going on. So the first one is going to be Zoloft. She's on Zoloft for 5 days. Probably not taking it the whole time, but that's her official script.
I think that I just want to point out we've had to make the time given to us work. We don't really know how long she took it, but what I know is, and what you know is, that she wasn't on it long enough for it to have worked or not worked. And I personally think that she must have had some sort of pretty severe, I don't want to say reaction, but something had to have been notable for her to go off of it so quickly. I'm pretty sure that it's like, I don't know, 6 to 8 weeks. You typically have to be on a dose of a prescription to see the effects that it's going to have.
To see the therapeutic effects.
Right. Right. But the adverse effects would come much sooner. Going from being on a Zoloft to Xanax, that's actually like 2 completely different things happening there.
Within 5 days. So whenever she took it, like say she got it on the 12th and filled it, and she took it on the 12th, took it on the 13th, wasn't feeling great, calls back and gets a new appointment. Doctor says take it one more day or whatever. So I'm guessing she had 3 or 4 days that she probably took this meds. This could probably be confirmed by counting the pills they collected, because it does state that they collected all of this. So some level of this could probably be confirmed. But on the 17th, she switched to Xanax. And on the 19th, she switches over to Klonopin and Ambien. And she takes it because she has traces of both of those in her system, but Klonopin is the one that she has the most dose of. So here's what happened to her. This is what I'm going to posit, and you can help correct me. A couple of these meds that we're working with here can increase anxiety and suicidal thoughts in people. One of the most interesting parts about it is even low doses of Zoloft can have a long withdrawal time, like up to 4 weeks of withdrawal. Now, that's kind of rare for it to happen. It's an adverse reaction, but it can also cause what's known as a citrulline storm. Zoloft is it's a class of antidepressant known as a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It's an SSRI. There are all kinds of side effects that can potentially come with Zoloft. And what's interesting about it is, as Meg was mentioning, some people can see the side effects faster than they see any kind of benefit from it. So this girl is suddenly going to find herself, she's taking Zoloft, and then she flips over within 5 days, according to what they're saying here. She ends up taking Xanax, and then within just 2 more days, she's prescribed Klonopin and Ambien, which we know she took at least some of. Well, what was missing from all that is within a week, she's killed herself.
And it doesn't seem like that really comes up. And I'm not really sure. To me, nothing there had time to do the right thing. I mean, except, a possible like severe adverse reaction. Like, for example, I had a friend who took, it wasn't an SSRI, but it was like I think it was Cymbalta. And they had a really negative effect from it. Like, it made them extraordinarily ill, right?
Yeah.
And so they had to stop taking it, like within 2 days of taking it, right?
Yeah.
Now, what's mentioned in the notes here is that she wasn't getting the results she wanted from the Zoloft, right? And then, you go from an SSRI, which what that does is it blocks your serotonin from disappearing, basically. And she goes from that to a benzo, the Xanax, which is a completely different thing. That's just a calming, an anti-anxiety drug, right? And then
You suddenly get the Klonopin stacked on top of it with Ambien.
right, and I wasn't entirely sure. It seems like the Xanax and the Klonopin should have been an either-or situation, but I don't know.
Well, it probably would have been an either or, but when you've done it, if you've done it that close together, because you're talking, so that's probably what it looks like from above. But if you're looking at it with the time frame in mind that she saw her on the 17th, saw her on the 19th, switched from Xanax on the 17th to Klonopin on the 19th, there's not a lot of time to do anything but take a pill or two.
Right. And so having experience and hearing other people's experience with these sort of, they should help, but, you know, as much as they can help one person, they can like cause harm to another person, just depending on the chemistry of your brain. I think that it kind of sent her brain into a spin.
Yeah, that's what my guess is. Because if you don't know this, the FDA has required antidepressants for a while to carry box warnings stating that antidepressants can sometimes increase the risk of suicide in persons younger than 25 years old. The warning is based on statistical analysis that were conducted by independent groups, so not coming from the FDA's own studies. This was watchdog groups who said, this is what's happening. And Ellen Greenberg is right on the cusp of that at 27 years old. But what they found was that there was a 100% increase of suicidal thoughts and behavior in children and adolescents and a 50% increase in the 18 to 24 age group. Suicidal ideation and behavior in clinical trials has been rare. But this whole situation is so weird. I think the answer is she probably had some level of maybe serotonin syndrome or something going on, and it was she hurt her chemical imbalance,
like it was misfiring.
Yeah, she just had a misfire, and she had a manic moment, or a whatever how you want to call it, but she had a moment where she broke, and when she broke, she was able to stab herself to death. And it doesn't make any sense of looking at it in the past tense.
And so from our sort of, podcast assessment here, and I feel really strongly about the whole timeline and it not being long enough for anything to have been doing the right thing. But I feel like, anytime you're switching things out like that, it could cause a catastrophe, not purposely, but under those circumstances, I would say that her death was not a suicide. It was not a homicide, but it was in fact an accident.
I think so. I think it would be self-injury accident with a contributing factor of what would be an adverse reaction to medication.
Right. But so the medicine itself didn't cause her to die, but it caused the situation that led her to hurt herself. So I still feel like it's an accident. I don't feel like she would have known what was happening, right? I don't feel like she could have adjusted it herself. I feel like the doctor probably thought, well, you've only taken it for 2 days. It's not really going to hurt you. Let's just switch you, right? Because she was having enough of a either reaction or non-reaction. We don't know enough about what was happening there, but for some reason, she went immediately off of the Zoloft and switched to Xanax, right, and then the Klonopin and the Ambien. And so I think even the doctor probably didn't think that there was enough involved there for it to be as harmful as it ended up being.
Yeah. It's really difficult to say this stuff, so I don't want people to think that we're taking this lightly or whatever.
It isn't lightly, and in fact, I will just say this. I have gone through switching medications, and it can be horrifying. I've had some really bad experiences with switching medications, and I didn't go from a place of being on nothing like I had experience with antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication or whatever. I've had experiences with those, and I've actually I know what she could have possibly been going through because I've experienced it. And if you're really overwhelmed and there's nobody there to kind of rein you in, it can be so I don't think she said, I'm going to kill myself and then killed herself. I think her brain just completely spiraled.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was probably in all honesty, it was probably just it was an afternoon that had the meds not happen in the order that they'd happen. And I'm not laying this on the prescriber either. I don't want to sound like I'm doing that. But if you had these meds and just the wrong balance, even if you had a little alcohol or something like that, there are a number of things that could happen where you wouldn't even realize how fast it was all happening. Just like, you're flipping through the different medications. And you have to look at the timeline and go, okay, that's a number of days. Honestly, there's not quite enough. If you look at the tox screen, I would have done a little more tox work on her, because what I had from her tox screen basically referenced benzos, and then it didn't give me any extra alcohol information, which could affect this. And it didn't give me any extra information except to say that there was a high amount of Klonopin for her to have only had the prescription for 4 days. And there was a trace amount of Ambien, which is there's all sorts of things that can happen to her. But I think ultimately, I think going after the city might be the right move. But realistically, I don't think we're going for undetermined or a homicide. I think we want more tox run, if anything's available, to do a tox screen to try and determine if there was some kind of adverse reaction that was missed. Just like that doctor was missing. Sometimes you just don't know to ask for certain toxicology tests. When he was missing different things in his sort of routine that he had going, he was worried about this from the perspective of it being a homicide or, having a lot of sharp force injury scenes, when he should have focused on asking for some more tox information.
Well, and without having the experience I've had with medication, and I was very hesitant about saying anything because I actually, it's nobody's business, right? Except here's the thing, without having the experience I've had with a psychiatrist, right? I wouldn't actually have recognized
that this was even a possibility,
that this was a problem. But everybody's, chemistry is different. And I do know for a fact, I guess anybody could have taken all 4 of those drugs exactly like she did and maybe not had any sort of reaction. But anybody could have also taken the drugs just like she did and had a similar reaction because it's messing with the chemistry of the brain. But when I saw that, I realized that was the biggest problem here, is that quick, switching around of the medication. And I honestly expected, I can't tell you the order I read the stuff in, but I honestly expected her to have been seeing that doctor for a year.
I didn't think a year necessarily, because I somehow knew she was sort of new to her, but I did think that I would see months of visits, at least maybe a visit in October or something, just to have as many swaps as she had.
Right, exactly.
And unfortunately, I think this gets missed because she really does sort of fall on this really fractional percentage of the things that can happen when you're on these drugs. You can find examples of people talking about suicides on Ambien or suicides on Klonopin or suicides on Xanax or Zoloft, but it's not that exactly that we're looking at. We're looking at the imbalance that happens when you bounce between the drugs so quickly and you're still suffering withdrawal effects from one of them when you're suddenly stacking another drug on top of it.
Right. And I think that it all comes into play because of the odd way that she inflicted injuries upon herself, right?
Yeah, that's really what made me think of it. Yeah.
Because, it's not a normal thing to stab yourself so many times to kill yourself. I have a feeling that she was trying to stifle this out of control feeling that I assume she probably had never experienced. I think that it would take a lot to not be some sort of pharmaceutical causing this sort of chemical reaction that was going on, and in the case that you take a medicine and it works for you, the results can be fantastic. They can be life changing, right? You can go back, to being completely normal after, having severe anxiety, which is what her diagnosis was. I didn't see anything about depression. Did you?
No, it was mainly anxiety based.
And I know everybody thinks that, mental health is mental health. It's not typical for patients that have a primary diagnosis of anxiety, right? Committing suicide. It's typically depressed patients or bipolar patients who are going through a depressive episode, right? That would be what you worry about, because anxiety is a whole different ball game, really. But typically a lot of people do have anxiety and depression at the same time,
or one leads to the other,
right? But there was no mention of it. But like we've said, she hadn't been going to the doctor for very long at all, and so who knows, it might have come up. I would be interested to know more details about exactly how that happened, the whole medication switch and everything. But I think that would be hard to do without making the doctor feel like it was her fault.
That's why I sort of prefaced what I was doing here. And people who, I don't like to make absolutes when it comes to these. I think a large number of people suffering from a large number of situations and symptoms of disorders can, I think that they can find themselves in a boat where they feel like it's too much. And I definitely think if somebody's just suffering anxiety and has some basic stress and doesn't need a big change, throwing them on something like Prozac or Zoloft it's one of those. It's a hard decision for a practitioner to make, to do that. And if it's not done correctly, the reason it's a hard decision for a practitioner to make is because it can have really strange outcomes. And I just happen to think that in all that we've sort of covered here with Ellen's case, I honestly think that Ellen is an adverse reaction to medication. It's so weird to say that because I don't want to make the doctor feel bad, because she was just trying to help this young woman. But even looking at her, even looking at Ellen Greenberg, she's a little person. She's petite. Medication has a strong impact on her.
I could totally see that happening, but just for the most part, antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, they help people for the most part. It almost parallels the fact that this is such a strange death. It would be as rare as somebody having medication having an adverse effect on them, right? You see what I'm saying? The weirdness of her death parallels the weirdness of what ended up happening based on her taking the medication.
Yeah, it's the one that stands out in my head when I think of sort of the new age deaths that people would know from this type of drug interaction. Is I always think of Heath Ledger, but he was sort of on the other end where he had quite a bit of there was quite a bit he was trying to get rid of, and that toxicology report indicated that the mixture he found in there, it was toxic for him. Now, this doesn't include any opiates in her system, and they did test for that. But and I don't. So, if his death was an accident resulting from the abuse of prescribed medications, I think that Ellen's death is an accident based on contributing factors of the adverse results of this quick medication switch. I think that's the only thing it could be. So weird that she killed herself that way.
It is, and it's almost like it had to have been fueled by something other than nature.
Yeah, and it was. So it's not a natural death, But it's also not a homicide and it's not a suicide. So for all those people out there looking to see if this is a homicide or a suicide, I can almost guarantee you that this is more like an accidental death. I don't even know how you would qualify that if you were like sitting in a legal proceeding. Like you could explain it, but I don't know how you could qualify it as far as manner and calls go.
I mean, honestly, without the experience, I wouldn't buy it either. I mean, I just wouldn't. But I happen to, pre-medication me, like I would never imagine drugs could have, pharmaceutical drugs could have such an effect on somebody, but I've lived through it. And so I know that it really can make you a little crazy.
Thank you for joining us. We are sponsored by LabbratiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabbratiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time. This is True Crime XS.
Well, I was this is we're kind of winding down the episode here, so this may just play as the outro or something. But you know what I got sucked into while we were doing this? In January of 2011, there was a Ambien report. I'll have to go find it. I think the guy's name was Gibson, but they were talking about Ambien being associated, even in tiny quantities, with parasomnia, with serious self-injury. Like a guy shot himself by accident. He fell asleep in the middle of the day, woke up, and had shot himself on Ambien. I'm
sorry, that's not funny, but
I was like, how is that possible? But that's what it is.
Well, I've actually taken Ambien, and I remember, I think it was a little bit before 2011. I don't know for certain, but I don't take Ambien anymore. But I remember like the crazy things people were doing while taking Ambien, and it made me not want to take it.
I remember a few things coming up where like some guy was like completely dressed and driving his car.
Right, and then he woke up. And they attributed it to the Ambien. And like I remember some of the last commercials that came on, like where it was an Ambien commercial. It was like some common side effects include sleep, eating, right?
Well, the box warnings. Have you seen the box warnings for Ambien that they added in like the last 3 years?
No.
It is crazy. Like they've started saying that like certain common prescription insomnia medications could create rare but serious injuries because of sleep driving. And I'm like, that's not a thing. Like you're not actually driving.
Okay,
you're just asleep.
But I mean, if it can cause sleep driving, I would say that while probably rare, it is not out of the question that it could cause somebody to stab themselves to death.
Well, so one of the big things that they pointed out in what I was reading recently is the contraindications of other central nervous system depressants and antidepressants. And it was so weird because it wasn't just prescription medications. They were throwing alcohol in there. And the bottom line on this type of thing is I don't think a medical professional today would have jumped her on and off Zoloft onto Xanax and then onto Ambien and Klonopin the way that happened. I think it might have been sort of commonplace at the time. And it might have just been, I don't think this girl took this medication.
I have a lot of trouble with that whole situation. I'm not a doctor. I don't prescribe. I don't know enough about that. I am only coming from the patient side of it, but there was not enough time for that to happen. Honestly, like Zoloft is something that you take every single day, and like the effects are cumulative, right?
Well, not only that, you have to take it, if I understand it correctly from
The
what I'm
same
reading,
time every day.
same time every day. Yeah.
Yes. And I don't know what her dosage was. I don't know, right?
They start pretty low.
Right.
So I would
And
imagine she didn't get a big buildup going on.
well, and I imagine that too. But it's messy. No matter what, it's changing what's happening with the serotonin levels in your brain, right?
Yeah, it's not like you're taking an aspirin. I mean,
But then
aspirin.
when you take Xanax, though, like you could literally have a panic attack, take a Xanax, and it would stop the panic attack. Like it's like an immediate relief. Okay, but and I guess it shows up in your system, but it's not a cumulative drug. That's my understanding, right?
I don't know much about Xanax. I just know
well,
it shouldn't be in the mix that she had going.
Well, I know that it seems like Klonopin would be the alternative to Xanax.
Yeah, I could see that.
Because of the class of drugs that it is. But I do think that nothing had time to work, and she must have been really focused on a specific result, because that's how it's sort of phrased. And I think that, the doctor was trying to help her. And
based on the escalation, I think it's sleep related, which is why I brought all this up.
Man,
anyways.
Insomnia can make you crazy. Insomnia is the closest to insanity you can ever be without being insane. Yeah. So all that piling up like that, I mean, I can see a lot, and it's really tragic. Like all of it's tragic, especially considering I imagine it was actually like something for her to go get help. So she had to like recognize she needed help. She had to go get help, right? And her mother indicates that, in their conversation, she had advised her to go get help, right?
Her mom even called the therapist. And that's the other thing about this that bothered me, that I still don't know how to reconcile for me personally. As I look at this case, it's not the cop's fault, okay? It's not the fault of the fiance. It's not the fault of the victim. It's not the fault of any of the family members. It's not the fault of the doctor who prescribed the medication. And it's not the fault of the medical examiner. Nobody knew. And
well, that's why I think that it's accidental.
Yeah, that's how it ends up in the accident pile for me with contributing factors. I think it's just like, that's why I referenced the Heath Ledger thing, because that's an accident, although he knew he probably shouldn't be taking all that together. I
don't think that he even recognized it. I think he had some sort of issue that he was looking to fix, right? And he just went to sleep and didn't wake up. I mean, that's what happened there. And I don't think
she also might have gone to sleep and not woken up. He went down to work out and she went to take a nap. It could have happened that way.
I don't know. I do know that, there was sleep eating was a huge side effect. And I would say that making a fruit salad could definitely lead you towards sleep eating.
Holding you come through